On the 21st of November 1980, guests of the MGM Grand Hotel in Las Vegas woke up to thick black smoke choking them in their rooms, where the odds of survival were dwindling by the second. Panic and confusion took over, with desperate men, women and children all trying to claw their way towards fresh air, which over 80 people would never reach, marking that day as the deadliest fire in Nevada's history. It was rapid, unrelenting and unforgiving, and entirely unnecessary. The fire could have been prevented. And maybe that's the reason why guests staying in the hotel, now called the Horseshoe Las Vegas and previously known as Bally's, will sometimes get the feeling that they're definitely not alone. And that just outside their guest room doors, that awful day in 1980 is playing out over and over again. So this story really starts in 1973, where the hotel was first opened by Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. You know, the big Hollywood film studios with the roaring lion? That one. They built a whole hotel in Las Vegas, hence the name the MGM Grand Hotel. And it was actually one of the first luxury hotels in Las Vegas, and I think the largest resort hotel in the world at that point. It was a very big deal, hailed as the jewel of the Strip, and it was designed to be just opulent. Big chandeliers, marble statues, like you get it. We're talking 25 bars, 8 restaurants, and one of the world's biggest casinos at the time. It also had its own private movie theatre, obviously playing exclusively MGM films, and there were 2,100 guest rooms laid out over 26 floors. It was huge and popular. Guests would flock to the MGM Grand to stay in this fancy new resort to make the most of their holiday in the desert. But there were people that would refuse to ever stay in that hotel. The construction workers who built it. I found a few instances of people that were involved in the construction of the hotel, and they were saying that they could not believe how many corners had been cut. They were like, yeah, the hotel looks lovely, never staying in it though. And one of these very important corners that had been cut was fire safety. The fire marshal was kind of like putting the pressure on them to install a sprinkler system in the hotel that then would have covered the entirety of the building at a cost of about $192,000. However, it wasn't like a legal requirement at that time. Like the fire safety codes in the 70s were a lot more relaxed. So they eventually decided that it wasn't worth the investment and they only installed the sprinklers where they were required to. And that included like some of the conference areas and the high roller suites on the 26th floor. And then sprinklers around the bank, obviously protecting the money. But places like the restaurants and the casino, they weren't covered by sprinklers. Because fire codes at that time, they didn't require sprinklers in areas that were designed to be open and occupied 24/7. And so like some of these restaurants, they were designed to be like a 24-hour place that you could go grab a sandwich at 3 a.m. kind of thing. And I think that the logic here is that if they're supposed to be open at all hours, there should theoretically be at least one employee in there who could spot a fire as soon as it was starting and then deal with it quickly. I think that's the only kind of logic I can kind of see being a thing, you know? It's flawed logic, but I get it. But for almost 7 years, they got away with it. Until they didn't. Because on the 21st of November 1980, there was trouble a-brewing within the walls of the restaurant known as the Deli. At 6 a.m, the security guy was doing his rounds, and it included going and having a look through the currently closed deli. Okay, so it's closed at this point in the morning. What is wrong with that sentence? Because when the deli was initially opened, it was one of these 24-hour restaurants. So it didn't have a sprinkler system because the codes didn't require one. But at some point it had changed to be no longer a 24-hour joint, so technically should have had sprinklers. But they hadn't installed them yet, if they had any plans to at all, I don't really know. So while everything looked okay to the security guy at 6 a.m, something was definitely going on. Because there was this like pastry display fridge that had been installed, but it had been put in badly and hadn't been fixed down properly. Like it was a complete mess. The cooling system that it had been attached to also hadn't been installed properly, so that was all shaky. And then the metal pipes that connected the fridge to this cooling system had been placed super close to an electric tube in the wall, which had like live electrical wires. But the shaky cooling system was causing the metal pipes to shake too, which were vibrating and eventually started wearing down on the protective casing around the electric tube. And so obviously this had been going on for like a super long time, but basically the insulation around the wires had pretty much been worn away. And this meant that part of the wires that were exposed were starting to get super hot, which was causing them to start sparking. And it was these sparks that ignited a fire in the deli that morning in November. And so all this would have been going on at 6 a.m. when the security guard came through on his rounds. But because all of this was happening within the walls, there was no way for him to see it. It wasn't until a maintenance worker called Tim Connor spotted the fire. He was in the deli checking for broken tiles at around 7 a.m. But by that time, the fire had broken out of the walls and was taking hold on everything around it. Before Tim could actually see the fire, he said he was just aware of this like crackling sound, like a bonfire burning. And then when he walked all the way in, he could just see a wall of flames from the counters to the ceiling. The fire was already huge by this point and spreading rapidly. Tim grabbed a nearby fire extinguisher and was trying to fight the flames, but it was just too established by this point. And there was like these waves of air pressure being produced by the fire that had actually thrown him to the ground twice. Like, that's how much power we are talking about here. So he decided he wasn't getting anywhere with this, and it was probably a better use of his time to try and help evacuate the building. Another employee who had also spotted the fire by this point, a Chef Oban, his immediate reaction was to run for a wall-mounted hose that was nearby to shower the electrical fire in water. Yeah. Luckily, someone stopped him before he got himself electrocuted and became the first casualty of the fire. At 7:17 a.m, the Clark County Fire Department was called and firefighters from Station 11 were on the scene in 2 minutes. Black smoke was already just billowing out of the hotel by now. But it's a huge building and there are about 5,000 people inside that morning. The firefighters were just about to go inside and start, helping with the evacuation, when an absolute monster of a fireball came ripping through the building. Like, the deli is fairly in the middle of this huge building, like on the ground floor, and this massive fireball ripped across the entire floor through the main casino in 20 seconds. Luckily, Captain Rex Smith, which is just such a badass firefighter name, he'd ordered his men out just before the huge fireball came out the doors. The fire was still raging and there were a lot of people still trapped inside this building. Some of them didn't even know the hotel was on fire at this point. Because especially for guests that were still in their rooms, it's still only about 7:30 in the morning at this point. If you've been out partying hard that night, of course you're not going to be bright-eyed and bushy-tailed going downstairs for breakfast just yet, are you? So apparently, the employees of the hotel that were able to were in the building trying to help as many guests evacuate as they could. But it seems to be kind of a bit of a debate because there seem to be some people that are adamant that the employees all ran out and left the guests to fend for themselves. But then there were others saying that the employees stayed for as long as they could to help as many people as they could. Oh, itchy nose. There was one guy, he'd commented under a video about the fire, and he was saying that his mother-in-law was a phone operator that day, and that she stayed on the phone and tried to reassure guests and was on the phone to them as they passed away. But then other sources, like the Las Vegas Review-Journal published that month, said that the smoke quickly filled the switchboard room, so operators basically only had time to warn the casino crowd over the PA system before having to get out themselves, which then gave guests on the casino floor a minute or two of warning before the big fireball. And then there were other guests that said, yeah, we had no calls, no warnings, no fire alarm with directions on what to do, nothing. Some guests didn't exactly help themselves though, and there was talk that maybe a few of them could not be persuaded to leave their favourite slot machines. One guest actually refused to leave until the pit boss personally vouched for the amount of chips that he had in front of him. He was about to win it big and then some fire's gonna come and stop him from hitting the jackpot? Absolutely not. It's all a ruse from the house to take his money, clearly. So the fire was still raging in the casino, and it seemed like the ceiling tiles, they were super flammable, and that was helping the fire spread really quickly. So the firefighters were working on obviously putting the fire out, but it was the smoke that was going to make things so much worse. Because the MGM Grand Hotel was built in the 70s, in the golden era of plastics, the smoke was so much more toxic with so many other nasties in it, from all of these melted plastic fumes going up into the air. And this smoke, it was thick and completely black. And it was spreading to places in the hotel that weren't even touched by the fire, because it was seeping into the air conditioning return ducts and the seismic joints that were there to try and protect the building from an earthquake. And it was effectively acting like a chimney, funneling the smoke all the way up into the highest floors of the guest rooms of the North Tower, which if you look at the hotel today is the one closest to the Flamingo Hotel. In some places the smoke had been filtered so that some of the nasties had been removed, but it didn't filter out the carbon monoxide. And it was these guests in these higher floors who had no idea what was going on. Which is just a cruel twist, isn't it? That it was these floors, particularly between the 19th and the 26th floors, that saw the majority of the fatalities. Some of them only figured out that the hotel was on fire when they looked out the window to see the smoke coming out of the building below. Or they'd see all these helicopters circling their hotel and wondering what on earth was going on. Others heard all this commotion of people running for their lives out in the corridor. Guests that figured it out would be a bit like, okay, hotel's on fire, need to get out, just go out into the corridor and join the other evacuees. There's clearly a plan, right? Only they'd run into the hallway and find it completely engulfed in that choking, thick black smoke. But if they hadn't taken their room key with them, they couldn't get back into the relative, if temporary, safety of their room. And then the panic sets in. You're inhaling smoke, you get disorientated, you're pushing the button for the lifts, but they're out of action. The fire has destroyed the cables. And that's why a lot of the guests who were trying to escape the smoke actually died in the hallways near the lifts. Something that I absolutely hate as well was that there were stairs there that you could use, but they were designed so that guests couldn't sneak onto other floors. Like, you could enter the stairwell, but you could only then exit at the ground floor. Because obviously the door would close behind you and you wouldn't be able to go back anywhere other than back down to ground level. Like, you couldn't even go back through the door you'd entered through, and no other doors would be able to be opened. First of all, how is that even safe? Like, for this very situation, if there's a fire, there's no way I'm going to get into a lift anyway. And then if the fire's under you, you kind of need to be able to get up to safety, surely? But also, I'm just not a fan of lifts anyway. If I can help it, I'll always take the stairs. I just don't trust them. Understandably though, guests trying to escape the fire were nervous about locking themselves in the stairwell, so they propped open these doors in case they needed to get back out into the hallways and back to their rooms. But this might have actually made things worse, as it allowed the smoke to fill the stairwells much faster than it might have otherwise if the doors were shut. The lucky ones were able to climb all the way up to the top and could make it out onto the roof. And here there was a local helicopter business who'd scrambled all of their pilots, and they were rescuing people off the roof of the MGM Grand Hotel for 2 hours. Once word had got out about the fire as well, the Air Force had deployed those big military helicopters to join the rescue effort too. But the only thing about using helicopters was that they were actually pushing the toxic smoke back into the building. But I mean, what can you do? You might have hundreds, if not thousands of people that need rescuing off the top of the roof. Eventually though, even if you'd decided to stay put and wait for the firefighters, the guest rooms weren't safe anymore. The smoke had started seeping under the doors and rising up through the bathtubs and the sinks, getting around through the plumbing. It was getting everywhere. After the fire, you'd go around and see little piles of dust and soot at the bottom of the air vents and places where the smoke had seeped in. And this dust just looks like black charcoal powder. And that's what people are breathing in. Guests were smashing their windows and opening the balcony doors to try and let fresh air in, but all that was doing was allowing the smoke that was blowing up from outside to swirl in, and making the situation so much worse for them. Some guests even tried to create sheet ropes to scale down the building, and this did actually work. There were some guests who were able to move down the outside windows and enter the building again at a less smoky level and then get out. But there were reports that others slipped and fell to their deaths. Allegedly, there were also others who potentially saw how bleak the situation was and chose a quick way out by jumping out the window instead of suffocating. But that seems to be a little bit contested, I'm not 100% sure. And then there were other guests that just died in their sleep, unaware that the smoke had even entered their room. I mean, like I say, this is still relatively early in the morning. If the smoke got in and you were still asleep, it might be that you just never wake up again. A local construction company though, they'd also pitched in to lend a hand, and they were using an electric lift to pull people through the windows that they could reach and evacuate them that way. Other guests though, they'd actually remembered their emergency fire training and had put wet towels around the edges of the doors and filled the bathtubs and sinks, and then kept the windows tightly sealed so smoke from the outside couldn't get in, and that had kept them alive. When the firefighters were eventually able to get up into the guest rooms and search for survivors to rescue, they actually found one couple who had smoke-proofed their room, and they were just drinking tequila to pass the time while they waited. But then other guests in their rooms, it was a completely different story. They broke into a room and came across an elderly couple who were kneeling side by side in prayer, and that is how they'd passed away. There were also a lot of goodbye messages scribbled on mirrors in lipstick, or last wills or letters to children written on magazine pages. It's just so tragic, and you can just feel that emotion as you're reading through all of this information. But what would you even do in that situation? If you were high up in one of those rooms in the tower, everyone's hollering out in the halls about the fire, you can see the smoke billowing underneath you. Would you make a run for it and pray that you could either get downstairs or make it to the roof before the smoke got you? Or would you wait it out in your room and hope that the fire was contained far enough away from you? Because remember, there's no way of knowing that the fire wasn't right outside your door or even underneath you, damaging the floor you're walking on anyway. It's a situation that you just hope that you'll never find yourself in, and you'll never know how you're going to react unless you were right there in the moment. Just absolutely terrifying. There was one survivor account that I was reading and it just sounded eerie. Like, other than that initial, alerting as many people as possible to the fact that there's a fire going on, there wasn't really a huge amount of screaming, especially as the disaster was unfolding. It was getting quieter and quieter. And yes, it was probably as more and more people around them were losing consciousness, but it was also because this smoke was so unbelievably thick that you couldn't breathe in enough to scream. It's just so difficult. You can't even imagine panic that these people would have been feeling, crawling over other guests in the hotel in near zero visibility, praying you're going the right way and not towards certain death. It's heavy. This one's a heavy one today. The firefighters took about 2 hours to bring the fire at the MGM Grand under control. And the fire never spread further than the ground floor. But 24 floors of the hotel, which hadn't seen a lick of flames, were completely destroyed by this toxic smoke. 85 people lost their lives that morning, with victims found in the casino and in the hallways, the guest rooms, the stairwells, and even the lifts themselves. There was also a female employee who was found in the service lift on the 26th floor. All of the guests and staff who had died in the tower had died from asphyxiation secondary to carbon monoxide inhalation. And the majority of the victims in the casino had also gone the same way, with only a few having a cause of death of burns as well as the smoke inhalation. A local trucking company had actually donated 2 refrigerated lorries that could be used as a makeshift morgue. And then obviously you've got all of these displaced survivors. So some were taken to the Barbary Coast, which is now the Cromwell, and that was converted into a makeshift medical centre. And others were taken to the convention centre. And there was something like 700 guests and employees injured, which obviously is a lot, but in reality, the death toll could have been potentially so much worse, considering there were apparently 5,000 people in the building at the time of the fire. But once the evacuated guests and staff had been relocated, then started the stressful task of trying to track down people who were in the hotel with you. There was one group of friends who were staying in the hotel, and some of them had gone down to grab breakfast, while 2 of the friends were still getting dressed in the rooms. And they later found those 2 friends in the portable morgue. There were some happier stories though. I mean, I can't really say happy about this whole thing, but there were 2 chefs and they'd been working in one of the kitchens when the fire broke out. And they'd kind of decided look, I don't think we're going to make it out if we make a run for it. So they'd locked themselves in the freezer. And they survived, and they were just pretty cold. So that's something. After the fire, the MGM Grand Hotel closed for about 9 months while the damage was being repaired. And there was obviously an investigation too, how had this been allowed to happen? How had this fire caused the deaths of 85 people? And they just found problem after problem. Even earlier that year, the fire safety inspectors had found 5 major issues with the building. By the time of the fire, they'd only addressed one of them. And the more I looked into this, the madder I got. So obviously there's the issue with the sprinklers, right? If they'd just paid the $192,000 and had the sprinkler system everywhere in the hotel, the fire never would have got further than the deli. And there were also faulty seals in the air conditioning system that had been the reason that the smoke was allowed to rise up instead of just staying contained to one floor. The entire fire alarm system was completely out of date and totally inadequate for a hotel of that size. It was also manual, so someone had to pull it for it to go off. But even if someone had, apparently the fire itself had destroyed the amplifiers, so no one would have been able to hear it anyway. Brilliant fire alarm system, disabled by fire, but there we go. The hotel did have an evacuation plan in place though, but it was about as useful as a chocolate teapot in that moment. Because yeah, they had this plan, but it was sat gathering dust and not actually posted in any of the public areas around the resort. So no one knew what the plan was. Obviously, in the aftermath, the hotel had to deal with lawsuit after lawsuit and had to pay out about $220 million in damages. Little bit more expensive than the sprinkler system now, isn't it? Quite clearly, fire safety codes needed to be updated to prevent this from happening again, but there was a lot of pushback from other hotels. Obviously, it was going to cost a lot of money to retrofit all of these older buildings to bring them up to code. And then they were just there arguing that it was going to cost too much and just be too much aggro to deal with. And so it looked like for a time the older buildings were going to get away with it, and it was only going to be new buildings being constructed that needed to put in place all of these new fire safety measures. Until literally 3 months later, when another fire broke out in the Las Vegas Hilton. 8 people died. I know, it's bit my chin, dude. They didn't really have a leg to stand on after that. Like, yeah, should probably make every building safe for humans to be in, you know? And so if you can take any solace from this horrifically sad story, there was one good thing to come out of it. Because of the MGM Grand fire, and then also the Las Vegas Hilton, every building had to have sprinklers, fire extinguishers, and emergency warning systems with like automatic fire alarms and emergency exit maps in all of the individual hotel rooms. Like, no building was exempt. You all have to have this now. Internal stairwells were also required to have unlocked doors, and if any doors were locked, they would need to automatically unlock the second the fire detection system picked up on a fire. So now, hotels in Las Vegas are some of the safest in the world because of these measures. But you're more likely now to drown in a fire because of the sprinklers. But I guess that's what they say, isn't it? Like, every safety regulation is written in blood. They have to learn the hard way before they make a required safety measure. So while the hotel did all of its refurbishments and came up to code, obviously paid out on all the lawsuits, the hotel management at the MGM Grand never officially took any responsibility for the fire, or faced any criminal prosecution for their fire code violations. Now the other one's crying. You see where you've started? Cats, man. However, the owner of the MGM, Kirk Kerkorian, he sounded like a pretty decent guy about it, to be honest. He was said to be absolutely crushed by what had happened, and he'd even gone so far as to tell his insurance company that he wouldn't be contesting any of the claims and did what he could to compensate the families of the victims. So while it's not going to bring them back, it's at least something, I guess. In 1986, the MGM Grand was sold to Bally's for $600 million, and it underwent another rebrand and refurbishment in 2023 to become the Horseshoe Hotel. And now it's had like a full revamp inside and all of that, but the deli where the fire started, it's still there. And now it's called Nosh Deli. But it doesn't matter about all of the different rebrands and refurbishments and things. It's always going to be known as the site of that horrific fire in 1980, which changed so many lives. But of course, there is another reason why I'm talking about it. And that's because it seems like at least some of those 85 souls are still trapped in the hotel, forever searching for that fire escape. Or maybe the energy of that awful morning has been stored in the hotel walls somehow and continues to play out on repeat. The casino floor itself is apparently haunted, with apparitions seen floating through the casino. Weirdly, apparently this happens on the casino's busiest nights. Or you'll be happily gambling away and you'll look next to you to see ghostly figures still playing the slot machines like nothing ever happened. And there's one specific entity, and she looks like an elderly woman who sits between a couple of the slot machines. So she's like playing 2 at a time, which is what people do, kind of play the odds a bit. The only thing is, her dress is on fire. Like, you can see the flames at the bottom of her dress kind of growing until it completely engulfs her. But if you go over to try and approach her, she just vanishes into thin air. But then apart from the casino, it seems like a lot of the activity is centered around the tower where most people lost their lives, which makes sense. So it's the Resort Tower, which was the original tower, because the Jubilee Tower was added after the fire in 1981. And the Resort Tower has apparently had some very weird happenings. It seems like, again, it's more of those higher floors, with the 23rd floor being particularly notorious. Guests will call down to the reception desk in a blind panic, saying that they can see disembodied feet floating in their rooms. Which is a really strange one. Like, is it because the floor height got changed in one of the renovations? But that seems like really major structural work when the tower didn't really get affected by the fire, so I'm not sure about that one. Or is it that the thick smoke would have made it like impossible to see? And so obviously the smoke is less concentrated at the floor, so you'd only be able to see someone's feet, maybe? But sometimes it is full-bodied apparitions that are witnessed. Guests will see glimpses of these entities, like they're standing in the halls, but will suddenly disappear right in front of them. Like they're just there and then they're gone. And it's got to the point where some guest room attendants of these higher floors will actually carry rosaries with them. As it's happened on more than one occasion where they'll actually see a shadowy figure of someone lying on the beds in one of those guest rooms. There's actually quite a lot of employees as well who will refuse to use that service lift on the 26th floor too, the one where the female employee lost her life. It's said that the woman's name was Maria, and there was a woman called Maria on the victim list, so it could be her that died in that lift. There's not been any specific paranormal activity reported here though, it just seems to have a really eerie feeling and staff don't want to take any chances. Which, yeah, is fair enough. There have also been lots of reports of disembodied voices heard all throughout the halls. You'll hear like crying and coughing all heard outside, just as if there are guests trying to escape the smoke all over again. There's even been reports of a young boy on the 17th floor hallway, and apparently he's like crying and screaming for his mother. The crying turns into coughing and eventually just completely fades away. A lot of people believe that this is a boy that got separated from his mom, but it's not been proven. And I couldn't see on the official records if there were any kids that died in the fire at all, but there was a lot of age unknown kind of things, so it is possible. Like maybe just protecting identities or whatever. And the rooms as well, they also have some reports of paranormal activity. One woman woke up in bed to see another woman, apparently dressed in 80s clothing, standing over her, watching her. She was so freaked out that she ran to the front desk and demanded that the hotel staff go and pack up her things so that she could check out and go to a different hotel. Like, just flat out refused to go back into that room. There have also been some alleged poltergeist activity, and it will be small things like towels falling off chairs, which, I mean, that could easily be explained away, right? But then when it's actual pillows that literally start rolling and falling off the bed, it's a little harder to explain away. A lot of the guests will also have this really weird feeling of being very nervous the entire time they're in the hotel. Like they're just on edge, cannot settle. And it'll get worse when they're in the guest rooms. Like they'll be terrified of the balcony and keep on having intrusive thoughts about jumping off it. And they'll also feel like at all hours of the day and night, they need to get out of the room. And I mean, it's a very strong, visceral, kind of like subconscious emotional reaction. But kind of understandable, again, considering the history, right? Thing is, these guests are adamant that they had no idea about the history of the place and only learned about the fire after they'd left. Which, I don't know, are they picking up on some sort of energy and emotion still stored in the walls? Or is it a little bit of an exaggeration and in reality they did know that there was a fire there? I don't know. There've also been things like cold spots reported where there's no AC draft, and then there's the smell of smoke that'll appear. And it's like almost choking, like it's so strong. And then disappear just as quickly. And the way I'm leaning with that one, it's similar to the guests feeling those strong emotions, right? It could be something paranormal going on and it's like an echo of that traumatic event, right? But also, especially with the smell of smoke, a lot of the time, hotels will just do what they need to do to get ready to welcome guests back. And I think there were a couple of reports of employees that I saw, and they were like, yeah, if you know where to look, you can still see parts of the hotel that are damaged by the fire or the smoke. Like, they've just built around it or covered it up and carried on. So could it just be part of the hotel where the smoke has seeped into the walls and you just caught it at the right time? Or is it that residual echo? Whether it is just guests' imaginations running away with them, or it is some paranormal playback of such a traumatic event. The thing is, like, no matter how many hotel rebrands it does, it's always going to be known as the site of the worst fire in Las Vegas's history, where 85 people lost their lives. And that fact alone could be enough to spark all of these ghost stories. But I'll let you make your own mind up. Is the Horseshoe Hotel haunted by the guests of the MGM Grand that died in the fire? Or is it just that people get really weird feelings in there knowing the history about the place? Tell me your thoughts, as always. For me, I really am in two minds. I don't want to discount any experience that anyone has ever claimed to have had in that hotel. Like, I wasn't there. I don't know for sure what you did or didn't encounter. But I do feel like a lot of it is because of the infamy of the fire itself. Like, obviously, it was an incredibly tragic thing to happen. And for 85 people to lose their lives in such a traumatic way, I can see why the hotel would now be haunted. But also, as notorious as this fire was, people die in hotels all the time. A lot of people even go to Las Vegas to, you know, end it all. And so they're going to be feeling very big emotions as they're checking into their hotel room. So with the Horseshoe Hotel, I think yes, if any hotel was going to be haunted, it would be that one. But hotels up and down the strip have probably seen as many, if not more, deaths from other things. But then again, none of the hotels even come close to the amount of people losing their lives in one go as at the MGM Grand, you know? But then, like, how much of what has been reported is actually paranormal? That part I'm not super sure about. Because I'm sure that if I ever visited, I'd be feeling all of the emotions of the place. Just because I know the history more than probably actually being affected by something paranormal, you know? And then let's not forget, like, this is Las Vegas. People are going out at all hours. They're going to be making a lot of noise in the corridors and coughing, maybe crying and doing all those things. But please, like, if you have ever been to the Horseshoe Hotel or Bally's when it was that, or even if you stayed at the MGM Grand, did you ever experience anything a little bit weird after the fire? Please do let me know everything down in the comments. I would really love to hear your experiences. And then if you enjoyed this video, please do let me know by just leaving it just a little like. Even though it was a very heavy story, well done for sticking through it. Gold star for you. And if you want more like this, you gotta be subscribed. I'm inching ever closer to that 1,000 subscriber mark, and I've got something very, very exciting in the works for it. So if you want to see what it is, you gotta do your bit, you know? But anyway, that is all from me today. I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious, and macabre. So until next time, sleep safe. Oh, it's a heavy story, Lucy. It's not a great one today. Okay, can I carry on now?